Hello, and welcome to AUA's Focus Series, a podcast channel from AUA's Media Lab. My name is Shant Shahrigian, and I'm the director for AUA's Center for Excellence in Journalism. I'm joined today by Susan McKay, Ireland's Press Ombudsperson, and we're going to talk about her career, what it is that Ireland's Press Ombudsperson does, and some insights that might be applicable in Armenia as people here try to strengthen journalism. Susan is an award-winning author and journalist whose books include Northern Protestants, On Shifting Ground, and Bear in Mind These Dead, about the family and friends of those who were killed, as well as some who narrowly survived during the Northern Irish Troubles. Her journalism has appeared in outlets including the Irish Times, the New Yorker, the London Review of Books, the New York Times, and the Guardian, where she was previously a columnist. She was Northern editor of the Sunday Tribune in Ireland until 2004, and has also been a senior figure in the NGO sector. Her leadership roles have included co-founder of the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre and CEO of the National Women's Council of Ireland. Susan became Ireland's Press Ombudsperson in 2022, the first woman to hold the role. Susan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So this is your first time in Armenia, and I understand it's been a bit of a whirlwind trip. So before talking about your career and related matters, I think I'd love to hear, what are your first impressions of the country?
My first impressions are that Armenia has in common with Ireland a sense of the preciousness and the precariousness of democracy. And and also another thing it has in common is very sad songs about difficult times and times when many, many people died. Politically, what I see is that you have a much more complex politics and political environment than we have in Ireland, because basically in Ireland, our only enemy stroke potential ally was the United Kingdom's, also known as the Brits. The British were really the only significant enemy that the Irish ever had in their battles. And so whereas here, you know, I've heard people talking about, well, what's going to happen now because of what's happening in Syria, and we have to be concerned about Russia, and we're worried about what's going on in Georgia, and what about the role of Turkey and what's going on somewhere else, and and obviously Azerbaijan, and all of these are situations and conflicts and political alliances and so on that we have no concept of in Ireland. We're aware of the EU, the European Union, and people have varying views about that, but it's a very straightforward politics by comparison with what you have. You're surrounded by bigger countries whose politics are going to have an impact on you. We don't really have that sense in Ireland.
Got it. No, that's fascinating to hear. And I mean, it's certainly a tumultuous region, a tumultuous time. And I'd love to build up as we discuss, the course of your career, what insights you have from the latest stage, ombudsperson, that might be applicable here. But I guess to start with... Well,
I should say also, my other first impression is everybody's telling me about this mountain. But I have not seen this mountain, Mount Ararat, so I have to take your word for it. I have not witnessed this wonderful mountain that everybody is talking about. Everybody keeps saying to me, oh, the view of Mount Ararat is absolutely magnificent from here, and I'm looking out at a wall of grey.
Yes. Yeah, the visibility can be pretty bad, but hopefully before you go, you can find a place elevated enough to see what's really a national symbol of Armenia, yet is on the other side of the border with Turkey. So it's a symbol on so many levels. But yes, I'd love to start chatting about your career. And I think since so much of your work focused on your native Northern Ireland, where you grew up, I was wondering if you could just kind of describe it, in terms for someone who, let's say, has never even been to the place. What is it? What kind of place is it like?
Northern Ireland is a tiny little place. It's really small. There's less than, I don't know what the population is, but it's less than 2 million. And it's until 1969, it was very much, it was the United Kingdom's little outpost in Ireland, the rest of Ireland having achieved its independence. After many, many centuries of fights and battles with the British. Ireland had been a British colony, but the rest of the Republic had separated, but the north was a largely pro-British little colonial outpost that was left over. It was very much dominated by people who wanted to remain part of the UK, but they did so by discriminating very fiercely against the minority Catholic community there. So in 1969, a civil rights movement had developed, and it led into a conflict that included a great deal of violence involving several factions, involving the Irish Republican Army, various loyalist paramilitaries, as they were called, who were loyal to the Northern Irish state, British state forces, a local police force, many factions. But essentially, the main battle was between the IRA and the British Army. So what seems like a relatively small number of people were killed, under 4,000, but you have to bear in mind that it's a very tiny country. So really a lot of people who knew people were killed. You know, a lot of people who survive today did know people directly or lost members of their family. Mm-hmm. I mean, it only takes about an hour and a half to drive from one side of Northern Ireland to the other side. It's a tiny little spot. Mm-hmm. So that all went on until the late 1990s, when there was a peace process, and that concluded with a much more democratic form of government. But obviously the Republican element in the North would still like to see Ireland united as a republic. So there's still ongoing political tensions between those who want to remain part of the United Kingdom and those who want a united Ireland. But the violence has by and large stopped. Yeah. But I think a thing that, you know, in an international context, what I would say about the legacy of the Northern Irish conflict is that it's really important that journalists recognise that conflicts don't end when the violence stops. And it's really important to stay and cover peace processes. I mean, in Belfast, which is the capital of the north of Ireland, all the big international journalists left as soon as the peace process was signed up. And actually the period that followed that is just as important in many ways. And I think that's something, you obviously know that here because you've had so many different conflicts, but it's an important thing which is often neglected, I think, that what happens afterwards is also important.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, just based on what you're saying and, you know, the way I thought you very beautifully introduced your volume, Bear in Mind These Deads, there are, without forcing it, I mean, there's a number of parallels we could make between the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the loss of Artsakh here. And one that I thought was very poignant that you said both in the introduction and you touched on just now was how, even though, you know, just in a cold statistical sense, the loss of life may not be as large as you find in some of the major conflicts roiling the globe. The conflict is someone, and those lost lives are something that affected everyone. And, you know, saying that about Northern Ireland, I'm new in Armenia myself, and it's only been not that long ago that the last violence over Karabakh took place, resulting in an exodus. But your description of Northern Ireland not too long ago sounds exactly like what I've seen in Armenia, that this is a conflict, and the loss of Artsakh is something that affected directly everyone in an entire population. And I guess to translate that into a question, as a reporter, how do you do justice to that fact? And, you know, and especially when, you know, today thinking it's almost like conflicts are competing to be the most horrific and have the highest number of casualties in some sick sense. So how do you do justice to a story which is truly calamitous for the people affected in this kind of 24/7 environment we're in, where it's so many conflicts they can be hard to keep track of?
I don't think that you can hope to, because people don't have the attention span to grasp all the conflicts that are going on, because they always are much more complicated than a soundbite can do justice to. So I think it's very, very difficult. But a thing that I think is very pertinent about the north of Ireland, which I'm sure is true of other places, is that the places where the violence was most intense in the north of Ireland were the poorest places, which are, of course, also the places where combatants tend to come from. You know, if you're from a poor part of a of an area. You'll probably be the person who'll become a soldier or whatever. And people also, they are at the hard end of suffering in those places, so therefore they're more likely to be invested in a struggle. So it's very striking in the north of Ireland that the places which were the seedbeds of the conflict are still the poorest places. So even though there's been a long peace process and a relatively quiet period, the question of poverty has still not been resolved, and some of the issues which gave rise to conflict are still sort of naggingly persistent.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me want to ask about some of your NGO work, because I think one of the things that's really noteworthy about your career is that you've done something not many journalists I know have done, which is start out in the nonprofit world, to my understanding, stick with it, become a leader in that field, and simultaneously have a major career as a reporter and author. So I guess to start with the beginning, my understanding is your first NGO work was being one of the founders of the Belfast Rape Crisis Center in the 1980s. Could you say how that came about?
I think it came about because I moved from, I had lived in Derry, which was in one part of the north. Then I'd gone to live in Dublin as a student, and I became very confused about my own sense of my identity as a person from the north, where the conflict was, because I come from a unionist, Protestant, pro-British background, but my inclinations are much more towards wanting to be part of a united Ireland, and I had a very strong sense of the injustice in Northern Ireland. So, but when I came back to live in Belfast after a few years in the Republic, I just found it really quite a terrifying place. It was much fiercer than I knew how to handle. So I didn't really know what my politics was in terms of the national question, as it was called, i.e. the border and, what was going on with the IRA and all of that. So the Irish Republican Army. So I got involved in feminist politics, and very quickly with another group of women, we discovered that there was this enormous amount of violence against women going on, which was masked by what was known as the violence. When people talked about the violence in the north of Ireland, they meant, the various factions that were fighting over the question of what the future political status of the territory would be. But we discovered that women were being raped and beaten, and to a really quite terrifying extent. And we also discovered that the people who were doing that were people who were, as it would be said, on the same side as the women. We used to get international journalists who would come and they'd say, oh, we would like to talk to a woman from a Catholic community who was raped by a British soldier, and we'd like to talk to a Protestant woman who was raped by a member of the IRA, and we would kind of say, well, that's not actually how it is. This is going on within communities, within families. And this was in the early 1980s. So a lot of what we were learning then has since become very much more widely known. But when I became a journalist, then I brought that feminist awareness to my journalism. So when I became the northern editor of my newspaper, I introduced a lot of coverage of things that had previously been ignored, I think, or not given much attention to. So I think that's something that has happened in Ireland over the last 30, 40 years, is a lot of feminists have become journalists, and they've changed the nature of the reporting.
That's fascinating. And I mean, my understanding of the Belfast Rape Crisis Center is that it was predicated on an idea of women helping women. And on some level, that seems self-explanatory. But I'm wondering if you could spell that out and maybe describe how you may have applied it in your journalism career.
Well, I think that in a very simple way in my journalism career, I go to women and ask them what they think, which is a surprisingly radical idea, I think, for a lot of journalists. I mean, I still am very surprised at the extent to which you see what's called in English manels, Are you familiar with that
I can't
word?
say I'm familiar with that
a
one.
manel is where, a panel of experts is put up on a TV
Okay,
program,
I can.
or or else you see a group of people who are making some important political decision, and it doesn't seem to have occurred to many of the men observing this that there's the striking thing about this panel of people is that they are all men,
Right.
And so
I'm sad to say I've been on more than one panel now that you mention it. And it is kind of, at some point, you're talking to male peers, sharing our profound thoughts about whatever the subject they may be.
Yeah.
And you kind of blush because it's conspicuous. So yes, that's my personal experience of this.
Yeah, and like in my present job as I call myself the press ombudsperson. I haven't yet got to the point of persuading my employers to change the title to ombudsperson. And I would say ombudsperson rather than ombudswoman, because I think it should be something that whoever comes after me might be a man, might be a woman, might not wish to define themselves as either. So person seems like a better idea. But some people believe that ombudsman, which is originally a Swedish word, doesn't have a gender attached to it, but I think it does. I'm told reliably that it does. And also I just think that when women get into positions that were previously only held by men, we should not have to describe ourselves as a man.
Yes. I definitely want to talk about the ombudsperson position, but I'm just taking a step back, and you described kind of lessons and experiences from the Rape Crisis Center, and you kind of applied them to the start of your reporting career, and said that change you've seen over the course of the years was more women, it sounds like, both in the newsroom and being sought out as sources. That made me want to ask the kind of classic question, but I think it's one always worth posing. What work remains to be done on that front in Irish newsrooms? Yeah, if you could start from there.
Well, it's still the case that there is a gender pay gap in Ireland, and you do tend to see that journalism has become feminised in the sense that a lot of journalists now are women, in the same way that, say, teaching is feminised, because it's not as prestigious a career in many ways as it used to be. And you still see that the people who are earning the most money tend to be older men. And that's partly to do with the fact that obviously income for media outlets is falling, and so wages are falling. But there's a sort of elite group up there who are probably men in their 60s, approaching retirement age, who will have had quite good careers out of journalism. Journalism in Ireland now, as in many other places, is much harsher for people. It's not so easy to make a living. There's a lot more freelancers. There's a lot more short-term contracts. So it's quite a disheartening thing to be saying to potential young journalists. I mean, the other side of that is that journalism is still very obviously one of the best jobs in the world, and the most interesting and the most exciting, and young people are full of their own ideas as to how to transform society and how to transform the way we communicate and so on. So it's, in many ways, I think it's a very exciting time to be in journalism, but it's quite tough. It's not so easy for people to work out how they're going to make a living out of journalism now.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be a universal problem, and just with local variants on it. But, American University of Armenia, as we were discussing some moments ago, it's launching a new master's program. And the language in the proposal touches on a reason for the program, a justification for it being underrepresentation of women both in newsrooms and in their leadership positions. So given your assessment of the lay of the land in Ireland, it sounds certainly similar here. This is a question I might save for the end of the conversation, but since it's come up now, what advice would you give to a young journalist in general, and a young woman journalist in particular, given that, she might take a look and see that it's still kind of the old men running the show, so to speak?
I would say be ambitious. Don't take no for an answer. Push. Don't be put off by the macho atmosphere that you will experience in many settings that you will go into as a journalist. Be rude. Be unfeminine. Push yourself forward. Get to do jobs that guys will try to say aren't suitable for women. You know, do everything you want to do and focus on the needs of people that you see as having needs. You know, so don't be told that you have to do. There used to be an attitude that women would do magazine-y stuff or fashion or those kind of things. You know, I think that's long gone, but there still are residual areas. For example,
my first book I wrote when I was about in my late 20s, and my first book about the politics of the North, that is, and people said to me afterwards, how did you get all those men to talk to you in that open way? And when I thought about it, I realised it was actually probably because they didn't take me very seriously. They thought I was just, as they would have said it, there's a wee girl, you know, in a man's job who thought she was a reporter, you know. So, but it's very hard to turn that to your advantage. You know, you do still get patronised a lot, I think, if you're a woman in the public space at all. So I just think women need to be really pushy, and I think that younger women are. And I think it's really good. I think that younger women are where it's at right now. Certainly in Ireland, the most interesting ideas and the politics are being developed by young women, and they're to the fore in all of the social movements. So it's a good time in some ways, but there still is that stubborn gender pay gap, and there still is that stubborn attitude that, you know, it will be the woman who will give up her job to look after the children or to look after older people, and the state is not stepping in to deal with those things. So, yeah, my attitude would just be, I suppose, to use the American term, go out there and kick ass. A young woman trying to make breakthroughs in journalism, as in politics or any other field.
Well, AUA will definitely have to have you back, because I'm sure a lot of students would really appreciate this kind of inspiring advice, and that, you know, even though the field has so many challenges built into it, there are not only approaches you can take, but there are people who will be rooting for you. So, I mean, a follow-up question might be, because I want to play a little bit of a devil's advocate, is, I mean, I think that the conversation about women in the newsroom, and I tried to be aware that I am a man posing these questions, and I'm sure they would be posed, you know, differently in a different setting or by a different person. But from my point of view, during my career, I've seen more, at least, awareness of the kinds of issues you were describing really within the past few years, working in the U.S. But now there's this whole new genre of think pieces back under the sort of subhead of backlash to Me Too, insofar as, you know, Me Too changed conversations in the newsroom. Have you seen that at all in Ireland? And what are your thoughts on the very latest?
Yeah, well, I'm quite old, so I've seen quite a lot of backlashes, and I think that feminism always reasserts itself, and I think it's the same for, you know, at the moment there's quite a strong movement towards, you know, respecting different genders in Ireland as elsewhere. So there are movements to make people more aware of how they use language, and if somebody doesn't want to define themselves as he or she, that you should respect their right to use the term they, for example. And I respect that in my role as press ombudsperson, that, you know, pronouns don't matter to many people who see themselves as either male or female, he or she, but they do matter to a small minority of people who don't identify with those things. So there's the whole thing in Ireland is this anti-woke thing, which is basically just a notion that we should go backwards and have a much more traditional sort of society in which everybody knows their role and so on. But that's not going to happen. So I think you just need to be aware that every time you make an advance as a person who wants to change society, there will be pushback to that, and you just keep going.
Yeah, so your discussion about changing women's opportunities in the newsroom reminds me of what's almost a new genre of think piece, backlash to so-called wokeism, backlash to Me Too. Could you say a bit about how you've seen that, if it's happened in your experience in Ireland?
It's happening everywhere, but I'm quite old, and as a result I have been through several periods when there has been a pushback against social progress, particularly in terms of gender issues. So it's just a thing that happens, and you just have to keep on fighting for what you're fighting for, because there will always be regression. And as soon as you make a gain, it starts to be taken back from you again. So it's a constant requirement of vigilance. I think what's very concerning at the moment is the sort of the growth of a new kind of misogyny, led by the so-called manosphere, which is basically a very traditional misogynist movement, but dressed up in new clothes.
Yeah, no, we could certainly talk much greater length about that. But as we wind down, we introduced you as the Ombudsperson of Ireland. Could you say what that role is?
Yeah, the Press Ombudsperson is a role which was set up by the Press Council. And I know that the reason I was invited to Armenia by some of the movements here was because it's contemplated here that there will be self-regulation of the press. And a lot of people who believe in the freedom of the press are aghast at the idea of regulation at all. But the reason why there is press regulation is because the law protects the rights of the individual. So, you're going to potentially run into trouble with the law as a journalist if, for example, you say something which is defamatory about a person, or if you invade a person's privacy. People have rights in that sense. So what a self-regulatory system does is that it means that the media itself, or the media themselves, decide that they are going to abide by certain ethical principles. And the government then says, OK, we will let you run this yourself. We will not step in as a state and try to run the media. And this came about in Ireland because it was recognised that the state was about to intervene and start trying to regulate the news media. So the news media decided that they would get around that by offering to do it themselves. So what happens is there is this set of guidelines which are all very basic principles of decency. They're very much the principles that are espoused by the National Union of Journalists, for example. In other words, tell the truth, do your best to tell the truth, do the necessary work to ensure that as much as possible you do the truth. Don't dress up comment as if it's fact. If you're making a comment about something, try as much as possible to base it in facts, but don't just assert it as if it was reality if it isn't. Respect the privacy of individuals, except if there's a good reason not to, like if it's a politician who's a complete hypocrite or something, who's living their private life completely differently from the way that they try to tell other people to live theirs, that kind of thing. Look after the rights of children. Don't expose children to danger or invade their privacy just because of something their parent has done. And it's a protection for journalists, really, because it means you're making yourself accountable to your readership. So what happens is if a member of the public thinks that, for example, their privacy has been invaded by a media publication, they can complain to me, and then I'll have a look at the article that was written and I'll say, well, actually, you're a public figure and you were in a public place, so your privacy was not actually invaded. Or I might say this was an ordinary person just going about their life. They didn't ask for or need or have any justification for being exposed to publicity in this way, and it has harmed their lives, and in which case the publication would be found to have breached that. So it's a way of giving the public a say in democracy, really, because, the press holds the powerful and the state to account, but the public can, through self-regulatory codes, hold the media to account. So it's a really very good intervention, I think, and it can avoid newspapers or online publications being completely ruined by lawsuits. Because if in Ireland, if somebody says that they have been defamed in a newspaper or publication, the newspaper immediately has to start paying out for lawyers. And before very long, you could have ruined your profit for that whole year. You could actually go to the wall. You could be finished by a lawsuit. So
And the idea is having an ombudsperson to whom to submit a complaint.
Yeah, it's alternative dispute resolution.
Alternative.
And it isn't always going to be sufficient, and you can't stop people going to the law if they want to. But you can say, well, look, it's going to cost you a lot of money to go to law to protect your good name. You could come to the Press Council and get it done that way, and it's free and cheap. It's free and quick, and you'll get an apology for what has been done.
Yeah, that's definitely a fascinating example. While Armenia, as you noted, has legislation under consideration to set up a possibly similar system. I feel like we could keep discussing this and many other matters from your very fascinating career, but I think talking about the ombudsperson role is a great note to conclude on. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for joining us and hope to see you back in Armenia again before too long.
Thank you very much.